What's up, YouTube? Do a little discussion today. Today I wanted to talk about the 5 things that a lot of yo-yo companies just do wrong. So, the 5 things that yo-yo companies do wrong. Now, disclaimer, this is not all yo-yo companies or a lot of them. This is just things that I've seen happen, and in dealing with other companies and just being around yo-yo players and talking to other sponsored players, etc. These are the things that seem to be not right with a lot of yo-yo companies today. And a lot of that just has to do with learning experiences and business acumen and everything. A lot of yo-yo companies are run by yo-yo players, which is great, but a lot of yo-yo players don't have a lot of business experience, and running a business without business experience leads to mistakes. So hopefully this helps either some budding new people who are looking to start a yo-yo company, or some yo-yo companies that are already semi-established that are looking to improve. So that's really the goal of this video. So let's get into it. Top 5 things that yo-yo companies do wrong. Number 1, too many sponsored players. So a lot of yo-yo companies go over their head with how many players they sponsor. I feel like sponsoring a player should be a lot of work for that player. That player should become somewhat of an employee. Think of Duncan. I feel like Duncan does a really good job at this, is that their sponsored players are, for the most part, employees as well. They do a lot of sales stuff. They do a lot of email answering. They get paid. They put them to work, more or less. But a lot of companies have a lot of sponsored players that really just sort of get a yo-yo whenever a new yo-yo comes out. So they get like 4 or 5 yo-yos a year, and that sort of ends up being it for the most part. I mean, they get a little bit of help otherwise here or there. You know, they get to stay at the Airbnb or whatever if they go to that contest. But a lot of times there's just too many sponsored players for a yo-yo company to actually be able to give their sponsored players and the really good top tier of their sponsored players to sort of give them enough support. Case in point, let's say, so this year, and I'll probably make another video about this. So this year, coming up, 2018, Worlds is going to be in China. So for American-based yo-yo companies, they are going to have to somehow get and help get their players, their competitors, their top tier, at least, competitors to China. I don't know if you know what it costs to get somebody to China, but it's a hell of a lot more money than it would cost to get somebody to, like, well, I don't know, Cleveland, where it's going to be next year, or even really somewhere in Europe. It's really expensive. I mean, just plane ticket wise, it is really expensive to get into China. And that's not even talking about visas and, you know, everything else that goes along with actually getting into China. It's hard to get into China. It's really hard to get into China. Like, I don't want to, there's no bones about it. It's hard and expensive to get into China. A lot of companies say, you know, you're a mid-level company, but you have 12 competitors. To pay $2,000 per ticket, like, that's gonna bust you. You don't have $24,000 to get your team. Like, you just, like, that's a lot of money. $24,000. I mean, you know, like, we don't sell that many yo-yos. The community's not big enough for that. Most companies can't afford to get their players there. I actually think it's going to be really hard for, like, the biggest companies like Yo-Yo Factory and Duncan. It's going to be expensive for them to get their players to China to compete. It's going to be really, really tough. You're going to see probably this year primarily Chinese players at the China Worlds, because there's just not... It's going to be really hard for the majority of companies to get a lot of players there. It just is. And a lot of that has to do, with the fact that it's going to be in China this year. But this is just a thing that's going to happen because, like, you know, sometimes stuff's in Europe, sometimes stuff's, you know, out of the United States, and that's great for those people who are in those countries. But I mean, it costs a ton to get out of the country, and if you're taking a team out of the country, I mean, we're talking big-time money. Like, the NFL and the NHL and stuff doesn't really even do that. You know, NHL and Major League Baseball go to Canada to play some teams, but, I mean, you know, we're talking about huge sports organizations that make billions and billions of dollars every year. And then, you know, talk about, and they don't go out of, like, they don't go to Europe or China or, you know, whatever. And then we're talking about the yo-yo community, which is not big at all. And it's like, oh, we're going to go to Prague, and now we're going to go to Iceland, and we're going to go to China. Like, that's going to drain your finances quick. So in order to be able to do that and to pay for that, either the players pay for themselves, which sucks, because if you've done enough work to actually get a sponsorship and do a lot of work for your sponsor, like, you shouldn't have to. But at the same time, like, companies are sponsoring so many players that they just can't afford, you know, $20,000, $40,000, $50,000 to get their whole team out of the country. Like, that's just, it's insanity amounts of money for companies that just really aren't that big and aren't able to even hire that many full-time employees. So that's difficult. So number one, they have too many sponsored players. I feel like sponsorship is a thing that should be earned, should be worked for. And there's a lot of companies that do it right, smaller companies that do it right, and, you know, they just sponsor local players, local teams, and there's sort of a local company that sells and ships things across the country. For larger companies, for, you know, big companies that sponsor national teams, they're just sponsoring too many players, and it pains me to say that, because I want good, hardworking yo-yo players to be on a team. But at the same time, I want those hardworking, good yo-yo players to be able to make the contests and not have to, like, empty their savings accounts to do it. Number two, I know that was kind of long, is there's just not enough organization. So yo-yo players are sort of known to be last-minute kind of guys, and a lot of yo-yo companies are owned by last-minute kind of guys, and that's fine, and those guys are nice, and they're very cool, but at the same time, the whole organization of the structure is very kind of haphazard. It makes it sort of difficult for outside companies and outside people to deal with those internal companies, because they have pretty poor organization. And that's not to say that they're not good and they're not good people, because they are. They're great people. It's just that they're disorganized. And I feel like yo-yo companies really, in addition to sort of scaling back on the size of the team and sort of be realistic with how many yo-yo players they can actually sponsor, they need to sort of be realistic with who actually is organizing and running everything and answering emails and answering phone calls and things like that. They really need to be up to, they need to hire somebody to be, like, on the phone answering the emails and, you know, doing the numbers, because the disorganization is difficult, especially when people are traveling all over the place to get to contests. It's really hard to travel a lot and then also do a lot, be a big numbers person and be organized and answer emails. Like, you're traveling and doing shows and things like that, and, like, doing demonstrations. To do that and answer emails and be able to ship things out in a timely manner is difficult. And I feel like a lot of companies could really benefit from having somebody there who was just sort of the organization or office manager, so to speak. Number three, poor utilization of sponsored players. So there's a lot of teams and a lot of guys who are sponsored players who don't do terribly much. So I do a video every single day. I'm not a sponsored player. I'm not sponsored by anybody at all. I have an affiliation, some team membership, family love with Zipline Strings. I hawk Zipline Strings, and I promote Zipline Strings every chance I get. And I am on YouTube every single day. There's lots of yo-yo players who are sponsored who you maybe don't see for months at a time. And I think that's, oftentimes I think it's their sponsors' fault. Like, they're just not giving their players enough to do, and they're also not paying them to do the things. So you get sponsored, you get a yo-yo, and then, you know, you make a video, and it's like, okay, you don't hear from that person for 3 months. That's sort of a difficult, like, situation to be in. So, like, you know, you got all these great players. A lot of companies have all these great players, and a lot of times those great players just aren't utilized by those companies. You don't see them in videos. You don't You know, you see them on their own personal Instagrams, but you don't see the companies promoting them. You don't see the companies pushing videos with those people in it all that often. Now, some companies do it, and particularly, you know, there's ramp-up times where you see a lot of that. But throughout the year, it's sort of ebbs and flows, and there's, like, oftentimes just not that much. And it's difficult because you know players who are just sort of waiting in the wings to do something. Like, they want to do something. I've talked to players who are just like, yeah, you know, I want to do something, but, like, there's nothing until there's a contest in a month and a half from now, and I'll see my sponsor then. We'll shoot some videos, we'll do some things, but it's, you know, there's nothing that happens between, you know, those periods of time. And I feel like that's just poor utilization of those really good players, and they need some direction and they need some help, because that's part of what sponsorship is it's being directed, it's being pushed, and it's being helped. And I feel like there's just sort of an underutilization of a lot of sponsored players, and I really feel like yo-yo companies, particularly all of them from all sizes, really should just step up and try to use their players in a good manner and in a good light that sort of just helps promote the brands. And I think that would be good for yo-yo overall. And that kind of leads me into number 4, is there's just not enough opportunity for players. I think a lot of that has to do with throwing back to there just being too big of teams and there being too many players on a team. There just isn't as much opportunity with such huge teams for those players to be able to, like, come back and say, all right, well, I'm going to do this video and I'll review this yo-yo, or I'll feature this yo-yo, and I'll use this yo-yo, you know, in my Instagram, and then I'll do a video on the company's, you know, YouTube page, and I'll promote it, and I'll go to this contest, and I'll talk to everybody. Like, I just feel like there's not necessarily enough opportunity for a lot of guys, and either there's not enough opportunity, or the opportunities aren't being seized. I feel like I have a pretty good audience, and I have a lot of people watching every day and listening every day, but I'm not a professional player. I'm not promoting any one specific product, and there's a lot of opportunity for the yo-yo community and people within it to sort of do what I'm doing, but it just doesn't happen. Not on YouTube, not on Instagram so much, and it, you know, it just doesn't, it's not a thing. So there's just not enough opportunity for players, or players aren't creating the opportunities for their companies. And maybe that goes back to number 1. Like I said, there's just too many sponsored players, and some of those players maybe are dead weight. You know, I think a lot of companies need to sort of look into that as well and think about that. And number 5, the last thing, is a lot of them tend to make poor investments, from what I can see. Now this goes back again to number 1, there being too many sponsored players. A lot of times, dead weight players and players that just don't contribute very much, I mean, that's a poor investment. Regardless of how little you give them or whatever, it's a poor investment. If they're not helping promote the brand, that's a poor investment. A lot of times you hear about players, you know, being sent overseas, being sent, you know, to all these different countries to, you know, help grow yo-yo. But at the same time, is that really helping? Should we not be trying to grow yo-yo, especially if they're American players on American teams and for American companies? Should not be trying to grow yo-yo in America and in Canada, where there's really a consumer culture. You know what I mean? Like, we have collecting is a very American thing. You know, North American anyway, because I know Canadians collect too. But should we not be sort of promoting that in America, so that, you know, you can get those collectors, get those guys that are my age, guys that have disposable income? Not to say that I have a ton of disposable income, because I decided to have children and send them to daycare, but, you know, guys that have disposable income, where like a $40 or $50 yo-yo, or even a $100 yo-yo once a month isn't a big deal. Like, that's really very American. And to sort of push out into countries that maybe that's not really the culture, collecting and buying things and being a consumer isn't really the culture, is sort of a poor investment. Why would you pay to send your best players and your best spokesman out of the country, out of America, to, like, speak for your brand for a place where there's, you know, yes, can you grow yo-yo and can you teach those kids how to yo-yo? Yeah, but are they going to be the kids that have like 3 yo-yos as opposed to getting the guys who will buy like 100 in America? I feel like there's more opportunity elsewhere, and it's less expensive to sort of send your players around in America, particularly to like grade schools and middle schools, and, you know, maybe pay for TV spots, as opposed to sending players out of the country or on trips to grow the community in those nations, especially if that's the origin, like if all of your base players and everything is American, to send your American players out of the country to try to grow Yo-Yo out of the country is difficult because that's expensive, but you could grow it in the country, and we're a consumer nation. So, you know, not that I don't think that there should be national and worldwide growth. I want that to happen, but at the same time, I feel like there's a better opportunity in America to sort of feed that collective and consumer culture in America and make more money there so that you have that cash to then, you know, when you go to Worlds or you go to, you know, EYYC or whatever, to sort of promote via the contest that's in that country at the time. Those are my 5 things. That's what I've seen from companies and working with companies and talking to guys, sponsored players, etc., about what's going on with yo-yo companies. I really think that we're doing a good job. I'm not saying all companies are doing this, and there's a lot of small companies who are doing very local things and just being awesome, and there's a lot of upstart companies who are really just doing it right. And, you know, this isn't everybody, but I feel like this is sort of a mistake that kind of leads to the downfall of what ends up being really great companies anyway, with really great yo-yos. So I would really like to see a sort of a like step back approach taken and just kind of a like reassessment and reinvestment in what works versus banging your head off the wall to what maybe isn't worthwhile. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. Make sure you like and subscribe. Tell me down in the comments, what do you think? Have you ever seen anything like this? Am I wrong? Am I turning back a rock? But let me know what you think down in the comments. That's going to do it for me today, guys. I hope everybody had a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers to you. I'll see you next time.